Buonasera, buonasera. Cominciamo questo dibattito, il cui titolo è La rete in bianco e nero, ma titolo che sovvertiremo subito. Io sono Massimo Russo e sono il direttore di White. Cominciando dalla mia destra abbiamo Andrew Keane, Michael Bluens, Evgeny Morozov, Nathan Jungerson e Alex Giordano. Metodo. Gli organizzatori dell'evento, secondo gli organizzatori dell'evento avremmo dovuto un po' discutere come apocalittici e integrati, quasi si trattasse di una riedizione di quel che Umberto Eco scrisse nel 1964 sull'atteggiamento nei confronti della televisione. In realtà, quindi, due partiti l'un contro l'altro armati, i bianchi e i neri, gli uni a favore dei magnifici destini progressivi del digitale e gli altri contro. In realtà credo che questa contrapposizione, sebbene poi qui abbiamo esperienze e opinioni molto diverse tra di loro, sia abbastanza riduttiva e in qualche modo anche superata. Non voglio anticipare nulla, ma credo che per la fine del nostro dibattito in realtà comprenderemo tutti che le cose sono un pochino più complesse del bianco e del nero, e come mi diceva prima Evgeny, è per questo che io sono vestito in un certo colore simile al grigio, insomma né bianco né nero oggi, ma ci sono appunto molte sfumature di grigio, anche se forse non 50, ma forse molte di più, per fortuna. Se dobbiamo trovare in qualche modo un punto di riferimento comune a tutte le persone che sono qui oggi, e che è se volete una grande differenza rispetto al dibattito che ancora c'è in Italia sul digitale, è che anche le critiche che vengono al tempo che viviamo, al presente, vengono da pensatori su questo palco che hanno studiato e hanno vissuto la rete, e quindi non parlano per sentito dire, come spesso accade nel nostro paese, e sono apoditticamente contrari o favorevoli a una certa cosa, ma hanno vissuto le cose di cui parlano dall'interno. Perché non esiste, come molti ancora credono da noi, mentre credo che si possa dire che questo è un dibattito totalmente superato, non esiste una distinzione tra mondo reale e mondo virtuale, ma ormai la frequentazione del digitale per tutti noi è un qualcosa che si intesse totalmente con la nostra vita quotidiana, e anche in un paese che non ha una grande analfabetismo digitale come il nostro, ci sono mal contati tra i 25 e i 30 milioni di persone che ogni giorno utilizzano intensivamente tutto ciò che il digitale rappresenta, quindi smartphones, tablets, contatto con internet, eccetera, eccetera, eccetera. Quindi non si tratta di una differenza tra amanti del reale e amanti del virtuale, ma di un ragionamento a volte anche molto critico, ma di persone che sono pienamente all'interno della contemporaneità. Due parole giusto per presentare le persone che sono qui con me. Evgeny Morozov è visiting scholar dell'Università di Stanford, viene dalla Bielorussia, è originario della Bielorussia, vive negli Stati Uniti, è uno studioso e uno scrittore. Il suo ultimo libro è To Save Everything, Click Here, per salvare qualsiasi cosa basta cliccare qui, ed è una forte critica al soluzionismo tecnologico, con occhio particolare big data e allo sviluppo, che non è futuro anteriore ma è presente, dell'internet delle cose. Poi ce lo racconterà. E c'è da dire che molti degli eventi accaduti dopo la scrittura del suo libro in qualche modo avvalorano e mi riferisco a quel che è successo quest'estate con il caso Snowden, Prism, eccetera, eccetera, avvalorano quel che lui, molte delle pagine che lui aveva scritto ovviamente prima. Poi, proseguendo alla mia sinistra, c'è Nathan Jurgenson, che è uno studioso di social media, che si è occupato molto dell'interazione tra online e offline. Tra l'altro è autore di un volume molto interessante che si chiama Production, Consumption e Prosumption, The Nature of Capitalism in the Age of the Digital Prosumer, cioè cosa succede quando tutti diventiamo sia consumatori che produttori. Ha coniato il termine fortunato di digital dualism e poi Nathan è la persona da cui cominceremo nel nostro dibattito e ci racconterà meglio di che cosa si tratta e gli chiederemo di definire questo termine. Poi Michel Bauwens, che è alla mia destra, belga, credo che abbia iniziato la sua carriera come imprenditore e poi come studioso, soprattutto del peer-to-peer, quindi delle reti di collaborazione tra pari, non solo nella tecnologia ma anche in molti altri campi, come un'alternativa possibile all'economia capitalista. Sta conducendo un esperimento abbastanza interessante in Ecuador, di cui a breve ci parlerà. Alla sua destra ancora Andrew Keane. Andrew Keane è uno scrittore, un imprenditore. I suoi due libri più fortunati sono The Cult of Amateur, cioè il culto dei dilettanti, e Digital Vertigo, tradotto in Italia con l'infelice titolo di Vertigine digitale. In realtà Vertigo è il titolo americano di un celeberrimo film di Hitchcock, che è La donna che visse due volte. Ho visto qualche giorno fa uno strepitoso speech che Andrew ha fatto in occasione di un TED Talk presentando proprio il libro. Dopo gli chiederò di ripartire da lì e raccontare appunto Digital Vertigo, anche se non abbiamo la fortuna di avere qui con noi né Kim Novak né James Stewart oggi. E infine alla mia estrema sinistra Alex Giordano, il fondatore di Ninja Marketing, attivista della rete da molti anni. Mi accennava prima di entrare che si è da poco aggiudicato con un suo gruppo un progetto di ricerca del MIUR sui social studies, sui social network. Ci faremo raccontare da lui di che si tratta. Io vorrei evitare un po' la sindrome da porta a porta e quindi la querella da talk show, e invece dal punto di vista del metodo mi propongo di procedere in questo modo. Il nostro tempo è fino alle 6, avremo 10 minuti per ognuno dei nostri panelist, dei nostri relatori, in cui appunto ognuno avrà la possibilità di esprimere le proprie tesi. Dopodiché in un secondo giro di 5 minuti a ognuno daremo la possibilità di interagire tra di loro e di commentare le questioni emerse durante gli interventi degli altri, e l'ultimo quarto d'ora prenderemo un po' di domande del pubblico. Credo di aver detto tutto. Mi piacerebbe partire da Nathan, chiedendogli di tornare sul concetto di digital dualism, che fa un po' piazza pulita di tutto il dibattito un po' polveroso che c'è ancora in Italia tra virtuale e reale, e credo sia un buon modo per stabilire un campo comune in cui vedremo comunque ci sono poi moltissime e anche aspre differenze tra le persone che sono qui a fianco a me. Nathan.
Thank you. I think what I want to do with my 10 minutes is talk about 3 ways to conceptualize the internet in black and white. I'm apparently the internet in black here. And so the first one is this concept of digital dualism. Apologies if you were here for the last session and you heard me talk about it for a while. Digital dualism is this idea that the internet is some other world, some separate world, right? A virtual world, as opposed to the real, this online face-to-face interaction. And what I think that does, I don't think it necessarily, I don't think digital dualists tend to be more critics or tend to be more utopians. But rather what I want to say is that both your critiques and your praises of the internet are better, they come better from a more synthetic view rather than a dualist view, rather than seeing the internet as some other separate reality. I always think of The Matrix, the film The Matrix, right? That's when we talk about cyberspace or a virtual world, we're kind of referencing the Matrix idea of the internet as this other space. And what I want to argue is that we're better looking at the internet in a more synthetic way, that what we're doing here, even face-to-face, even if you're not looking at a glowing screen, is still deeply technological. It's still deeply influenced by the internet. That's a more synthetic view, and also that means when you're on the internet, that's still embodied, that's still physical, that's still political, it has a history. So I think digital dualism allows us to really make 2 mistakes. I'm a critic of digital dualism. I think it's wrong. The first mistake, oftentimes you hear people say, oh, people are trading real interaction for something virtual. Right? That's forgetting that when people are talking using Facebook or GChat or something like that, that really is real interaction. It's embodied, it's political. But also the other mistake that we often see comes from maybe the more utopian side. When people created the internet, they talked about it as a revolutionary new space. There's a book card in the conference package that says, I don't read Italian, but it sure looks like something to the effect of, let the digital revolution continue. And the idea is that the digital is this new space where anything can happen. And what happened when we built the digital space? The digital space, well, there really was never a digital space. The digital reflected the politics and histories of the people that created it. And so I think dualists make both these mistakes coming from more positive and negative views of the web. And 2 more points very quickly. What I hope that this debate, or however this ends up going, doesn't make 2 more mistakes. One is what we call technological determinism. The idea that technology determines what people do. This is when people say Facebook is making us lonely or narcissistic, or Facebook or Twitter causes a revolution, right? So certainly that comes from both the utopian and dystopian views. And the opposite mistake of determinism is what people often call instrumentalism. Right? Instrumentalism, the most famous articulation of instrumentalism, at least from an American perspective, is guns don't kill people, people kill people, right? Or sometimes you hear the internet is just a tool, that we can do anything we want with the internet, it's just a tool. And in the last talk we talked about affordances. That is that certain technologies allow us to do certain things and don't allow us to do certain things. If you're holding a gun, different people appear killable. Right? Guns really do influence the person that's holding it. The internet isn't a passive tool. And so we can make, taking either of those perspectives too far, that we can do anything with the internet or the internet causes us to do something. Those are both mistakes, and I hope this panel avoids that. And the last thing I want to say is that I think critiques of the internet and praises of the internet need to remember that, going back to the digital dualism critique, that the internet and technology is deeply complex and multifaceted. I know that sounds like a cliche, but that's how everyday life is, and the internet is everyday life. And when we critique the internet or praise the internet, we're doing it from our perspective. You know, right now we have a panel that represents one very specific perspective. Certainly it's a male perspective. You know, I don't know if this panel is going to be necessarily prepared to talk about young women taking selfies or something like that. I think we have a very specific perspective on this stage, and we need to keep that in mind and not make our criticisms and our praises apply to everybody across the board. We're never prepared to do that. So those are the 3 things I'm going to kind of watch out for as I listen to this debate go on.
You just used 4 minutes and 30 seconds of your time, so you have 5 minutes more. But I would like you to go. I found something you wrote about unplugging and digital detox very interesting. I would like you to tell to us about that.
A sociologist going under time is very, very rare. So yeah, I wrote this essay called The IRL Fetish, and maybe that has a funny Italian translation. So the idea here is that I think we've come to not just appreciate disconnection, but we've come to fetishize that. And I'm thinking of there's the digital detox movement, the digital Sabbath, unplugging, disconnection. Every week there's a new op-ed about how profound it is to leave your phone behind for 1 day a week or a week every year or something like that. And I think that makes two mistakes. When I say fetishizing disconnection, I don't mean just appreciating disconnection. I appreciate time away from my phone. I wrote the essay Camping, but I had no connection. I appreciate connection, but to fetishize it does two things. One, it makes the mistake of thinking that time away from your phone is really disconnected. It isn't. I appreciate camping or being disconnected from my phone partly because I spend so much time in front of a screen, right? And in that sense, I think one of the main reasons that we appreciate face-to-face conversations even more than ever today is because of the time that we spend on screens. I see a lot of my friends in New York have books on their shelves like this, real chunky, dusty, old books. And people my age in New York, I can't speak to the Italian experience, love stuff like that because we spend so much time with MP3 players and digital devices. So we've really come to appreciate the analog and the disconnected more than ever before. And so in that sense, when we are talking face-to-face or we're dealing with something analog here, we're appreciating that partially because of the digital. That is, the digital is still influencing our time spent away from the computer. And then the second mistake, when I say fetish, is that I feel like we've started to use disconnection to rank people. We've talked about our own disconnection as somehow special. This goes back to digital dualism, the idea that connection is somehow virtual or not real. We're trading real connection for something digital, something virtual, something simulated, less real. And I think what we're doing is we're ranking people. We're ranking people on how real they are, how human they are. Those are the high stakes of digital connection right now. And I think it's a little out of whack. It's a little heavy-handed to rank people on their humanity. What is more real? What is more deep? People say, oh, Twitter is so shallow, things like that. These people are just very flippantly throwing out these critiques that are ultimately about people's very humanity. And I think we need to cut that out. Let's critique the internet for many reasons, but not because it isn't real. It is real. And let's stop ranking each other and stop patting ourselves on the back for the time we spend disconnected. Enjoy time away from your phone, but it doesn't make you a special person. Sorry.
Molto interessante questa idea che la critica in qualche modo a chi vive pienamente, quella che chiamiamo come vita aumentata, sia in qualche modo un modo per tentare di diminuire quanti sono totalmente contemporanei e non affrontare invece le questioni vere che questa contemporaneità pone. Una persona che invece le ha affrontate, le sta affrontando in pieno è Evgeny Morozov, che è qui alla mia sinistra, al quale vorrei chiedere due cose. Primo, se nel suo intervento ci può raccontare il suo atteggiamento nei confronti dei big data. Seconda cosa, che ho trovato la parte più interessante del suo lavoro, questa necessità, questa differenza rispetto alla critica che molti altri fanno ai big data, di non appellarsi alla necessità di nuove leggi o di nuove regolamentazioni, di un mondo che comunque è molto più veloce e cambia assai più in fretta di qualsiasi regolamento non si possa immaginare, ma invece di promuovere una sorta di consumo intelligente e in qualche modo di far sì che le persone siano più avvertite dei rischi e degli spill-off dei loro aspetti nel consumo del digitale. Un po' nello stesso modo di quanto è avvenuto negli ultimi 20 anni, quando siamo diventati un pochino tutti più avvertiti dell'ambiente e quindi abbiamo iniziato a consumare in maniera più consapevole. E quindi mettere le persone in guardia dai rischi del consumismo digitale. Ecco, Evgeny, ci vuoi parlare un po' dei big data e del consumismo digitale?
Sure, thank you. I'll get there eventually. I'll just start somewhere else, if you don't mind. It used to be very easy to be visiting various internet festivals and conferences because the questions were always very easy. You would show up and then you would say, well, the internet is great, or the internet is evil. And then you'll have a 2-hour discussion where people would just be arguing with each other whether it is more evil than they think, or less evil, or more good, or less good. And then, you know, today what we've heard from Nathan, I think is mostly a correct picture of how complex our networked and digital environment is. I'm just not sure, and I agree with most of the things that, you know, we've so far heard about the internet. I'm just not sure what's left of the very idea of the internet, having heard Nathan deliver the presentation. And he kind of skirted that issue in that, you know, he told us that, well, cyberspace probably doesn't exist because we all exist in real physical embodied space. And then all technologies have very different logics and they don't have determined effects, and there is no technological determinism. So, but at the same time, all of them seem to have specific effects. We just can't predict them. And then the question is, do we really need this big meta construct of the internet, and what role does it play? And personally, I have actually stopped using that term altogether, and I just don't find it particularly useful to understand where we are and where we are going. And I think if you think about our gadgets, our household gadgets, everything that we buy in the marketplace, you probably can guess that in the next few years, if not months, all of them will have some kind of connectivity built into them. You already see, for example, with the rise of the buzz around the smart city, you already see people planning to have traffic lights that will be communicating with your car, and your car will be communicating with your fridge, and your fridge will be communicating with your store, and it will then communicate with your car, and everything more or less will have internet connectivity. Your toothbrush will have both a sensor and an internet connection in it, so that it will monitor how you brush your teeth and eventually get in touch with your dentist and your insurance company, transmitting the data to them, right? And people are already talking about new ownership models that you might actually be getting a lot of the stuff that you use on a daily basis for free, right? But you will be paying for it and subsidizing it essentially with your own data. And one way to think about all of this phenomena, the proliferation of the internet, to stick to that term for a while, in the physical world, you can think about it from a very sort of conventional, conservative, moralistic perspective, and then just say, well, technology invades everything. Or you can say the internet invades everything. But in fact, it's not technology, or it's not the internet. It's new modes of economic exchange and new modes of political exchange, and ultimately it's capitalism and consumerism that ought to be brought into the picture. That's the reason why everything gets interconnected. It's ultimately connected to your personal data, and it's ultimately connected to the personal purchase and consumer decisions that you'll be making one day or another. And for me, there is no way to understand what's happening with sites like Facebook or Twitter or Google, or with any of the gadgets or apps or self-tracking apps that are currently in such great vogue, without bringing such economic and political considerations to the table. So I can very easily understand why someone would not want to spend their entire day on Twitter without smuggling any notions of the virtual or the digital that Nathan is so critical of. Let me just give you an example that I think might open some debate or might clarify what I think about it. Those of you who are older probably remember that old age when we still had telegrams, right? And those were delivered to you, or almost hand-delivered to you, right? And imagine if you had some kind of a communication system where a postman would show up at your door every 20 seconds and would deliver you a telegram and keep ringing the buzz whenever he or she is there. I mean, you'd probably get annoyed and decide to finally disable your buzzers so that they cannot appear at your door and buzz you, right? You can build a nice story about how it'd be resisting the beauty of communication, how it'd be resisting the network that is the postal system, how it'd be resisting whatever it is that you're resisting. But I think ultimately here, if that process is driven by the need to check on what it is that you do every 20 seconds for reasons that have to do with surveillance or advertising, it's a normal reaction to want to opt out, right? You don't need to build an extra theory of postality or telegramma, whatever, ality, right, to understand how you decide to opt out of this regime, right, in order to understand your behavior. So I am much more resistant than theories like Nathan to somehow reduce everything to a critique of digitality or virtuality. I think there are good reasons for us to want to stay away from some of the communicative and networked regimes where the intention is to hijack our attention, to learn more about us, to force us to communicate in ways that perhaps we would not want to communicate if the networked environment was not configured in this way, right? And here we really need to understand the insights from cognitive science and psychology and information design. And clearly, there is a reason why a site like Twitter wants you to come back and click on the refresh the page tab on the site, because they want to record your every click, and the more clicks they record and the more interactions you generate with the site, the more they know about you, the better advertising they can sell, right? And from my perspective, if I think about the quality of communication and I root that approach in some kind of cognitive or psychological theory of what productive, meaningful, deep, good communication is, perhaps that business-oriented logic is not necessarily what I would want to have in a system like Twitter, right? Perhaps what I would want to do is not to ensure that people go and every 5-second check on the tab who has written about them, but instead they actually are forced to think about issues that fall outside of their traditional interests, or they click on links that are not shared by people that they follow. There are all sorts of things you can be doing in a platform like Twitter that will not result in Twitter knowing more and more about you and serving you more and more ads. The reason why a certain mode of behavior is attached to a platform like Twitter is because Twitter is driven by commercial logic, and there are, I think, very good reasons why we need to understand how that logic has evolved, what it wants from you, and how that logic translates into certain technological design options and choices and decisions, right? I was thinking just the other day about, imagine if Google was around in the 18th or 19th century when the postal office in America, for example, was just about to get started, right? And imagine how Google would want to run that system. They would tell you, well, you don't have to pay any money for stamps, right? So forget about stamps. All the mails will be mailed for free. But what we would do is that we would open every envelope and we would scan every letter and we would insert a little flyer and then we'll repackage it, and then, oh, great. I mean, you don't have to pay for stamps anymore. That's a system that we now have with email, right? Most of us have probably accustomed ourselves to a network like Gmail, right? And most of us probably still feel somewhat uneasy about the option I've just outlined for the postal mail, right? But again, the system here is the same. And the reason why some people would or should feel uneasy about Gmail has nothing to do about virtuality or digitality, but has everything to do with the business model that Gmail has at its heart, and that a publicly run institution like the postal office that has not yet been privatized doesn't, right? Because the publicly run postal office is not interested in learning more about you because they are not there accumulating personal information to sell you more ads. The entire ethos is very different, and they are there to serve the public, right? And I think since the early 1990s, where everyone thought that the success of networked and digital computing is only a function of entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley building things, we have lost the faith in the ability of public institutions to play a useful role in running and administering some of our communication infrastructure in a mode that will not just be driven by considerations of capitalism and profit making. And I think the sooner we give away and the sooner we depart from some broader narrative of the internet with its fairy tales about the role of entrepreneurship, the role of private enterprise in making it happen. I mean, if you just follow the debates in America, they're crazy. I mean, last year, if you heard Obama say what he said when he made the comment that you didn't build that, when he was talking about internet infrastructure, right? He was saying that it was the government who built the infrastructure for the internet, right? And that then other things developed. The conservatives went crazy, and they started pointing out that the real thing happened only in 1994, 1995, when NSF, the National Science Foundation, gave the internet to the private enterprise, and it sort of surrendered public control over those networks, and it's the Googles and the Yahoos and others who stepped in. You already see that the very existence of an idea like the internet generates these tense ideological battles where people on the left say that, well, the government played an essential role, and we have to celebrate the role that the public institutions can play. Look at what happened. Look at the success of the internet, with people from the right and more conservative pro-market crowd saying that, no, the real internet begins not in 1970, but in 1995, right? So that very narrative becomes a prisoner to these ideological battles, and I'm just not sure that that fight can actually be won. What we need to do, I think, is to step outside of that narrative and actually figure out what kind of economic models we want to have supporting what kind of communication functions. And it might be that as our leaders are all aggressively jumping on ideas like the smart city, right? They jump on it because they think that, well, this is great to have digital technology and communications and networks everywhere, right? But that's not the right reason to introduce networks or digification or quantification into how our cities function, right? We have to go and think very hard about whether you actually would want a company like Cisco or HP optimizing the processes that perhaps ought not to be optimized in the first place, or whether those processes ought to be optimized with commercial logic in mind, or the market logic in mind, rather than non-commercial logic, right? It has nothing to do with where we are with regards to technology. It has nothing to do with what we must do to catch up with some digital benchmark. It has nothing to do with social media, right? And I think what we need to do is to go and start thinking much harder about what kind of infrastructure we want to have in place and what kind of economic models we want to have supporting that infrastructure. And it might be that we'll realize that for some of those activities, it's enough to have a fully commercial system in place. For some, we might realize that we want a non-commercial one. And it might be that we as citizens need to take a much more active role in thinking about how information these days is exchanged among us, technology companies, and government agencies. And I would want to argue, to sort of finally answer the question about big data, is that it's not actually just the NSA or the various intelligence agencies that are interested in gathering all this data. It's a very profound shift in how all public institutions think about problem solving. And this profound shift is all driven by an embrace of what I would call preemptive logic, right, or logic of preemption. All public institutions would rather preempt problems rather than let them happen and then deal with the consequences. Right? And you see it with terrorism. And with terrorism, this is a very easy case to make. You would rather step in and go and try to disrupt an act of terror before it happens, rather than wait until it happens and then deal with the aftermath, right? But you can apply the same logic to all sorts of other problems, right? Obesity. You don't want too many people to get too fat, so what you do is that you rely on the new digital infrastructure that is out there, cell phones, smartphones, Google Glass, screens, interfaces, devices, you name it, to try to interject, essentially, yourself into their decision-making process, right? And generate all sorts of pop-ups on their screens telling them that, well, you need to exercise more, or you need to eat less fat, or you need to eat more vegetables, or whatever. Again, the logic here is that you would want to insert yourself and try to preempt the problem rather than to let it happen. But you see what happens as the amount of data that is available for problem solving proliferates. We no longer actually ask about the structural reasons and the structural causes for many of the problems. Look at how in America we are dealing with a problem like terrorism. Right? No one anymore is asking a very crucial question. How does the use of drones in Yemen contribute to the radicalization of Yemeni kids who then want to go and blow themselves up? Right? If you want to solve a problem like terrorism, that's a pretty good question to ask. Right? Another good question to ask is how U.S. foreign policy towards Saudi Arabia leads to radicalization of many people in the Middle East. It's a very good, deep structural problem that we in a democracy ought to be asking on a regular basis. You can be asking the same questions about climate change, obesity, energy consumption, you name it, all of the problems that we are trying to preempt. Instead, what we do is that since we are saturated with data, we try to identify people who look most dangerous and do something about those people. Right? Without actually asking why those people are the way they are, or why they are radicalized, right? And as a democracy, I think we actually risk losing the very kinds of democratic, wide public debates that we used to have about problems, right? And we used to have about different alternatives, different solutions, and different priorities, right? It might be that in some cases, we have no other choice but to deal with the symptoms of the problem. But it might be that we actually need to go and address the causes. And if you want to address the causes, simply dealing with the problems through information and digital infrastructure is not going to help. I'll just give you one example and I finish. So think again about the wonderful opportunities that many policymakers in both Washington and Brussels have now identified with regards to self-tracking. Right? Again, your cell phone, your smartphone has sensors that can monitor everything about you, and they already do. Google now, one of the apps Google has built, monitors how much you walk on a daily basis. And at the end of the month, it can present you with a card telling you that this month you've walked 20% less than the previous months. The idea is that, again, with a problem like obesity, they want you to spend more time exercising, and that's the contribution that Silicon Valley can make to helping to save the world, right? That's the logic in which Silicon Valley now finds itself, and that's the logic that they like to invoke themselves when they talk to regulators. But think about it, what happens. The assumption on which you start problem solving in this manner assumes that you as a consumer and as a citizen essentially are irrational, right? You start on the assumption that there is something about you that ought to be corrected. You need to be told that you need to walk more. You need to be told that you need to exercise more. You need to be told that you need to eat less junk food, right? And that's the principle in which you start. And here, of course, the logical solution is that if you're irrational, you need to be given more information. So we'll give you more information and solve the problem, right? But if you are a poor mother with 5 kids living in the middle of America who has to work 3 jobs and who has no time, no money, and particularly, no free time to actually go and drive 20 miles to the nearest farmer's market, and who doesn't have a car, and who is not particularly able to afford buying vegetables when junk food is so cheap, it's not at all irrational to be buying junk food to feed your kids, because the other option is not feeding them, right? And if that's the environment in which you find yourself, right, then there is nothing that information can do here. What we need to be doing is going and doing something about infrastructure, doing something about income inequality, doing something about money, doing something about free time, doing something about regulating how, for example, food companies advertise to children with regards to junk food. doing something about the lobbyist in Washington. Those are all the kinds of interventions that digital technology cannot solve and will not solve, right? So my fear is that we, armed with this excellent digital infrastructure, actually aiming for the low-hanging fruit. We are not solving the most important problems that ought to be solved. We are not tackling their causes. All we do are tackling their symptoms by offloading all the problem solving on citizens, right? Rather than institutions, rather than lobbyists. That's awful. And the better we can understand the specificity of the current situation by forgetting all of the bad metaphysics that ideas like the internet smuggles in our debate, the better. So I would say start thinking politics, start thinking economics, forget the digital, forget the internet.
Grazie Evgeny. Sei andato leggermente oltre con i tempi, ma insomma due cose, due notazioni che mi sembra possano sintetizzare il suo intervento sono: la prima, piuttosto che rendere intelligenti le cose, quindi smart things, l'internet delle cose, sarebbe meglio rendere più intelligenti, consapevoli e dare possibilità di scelta alle persone. E l'altra cosa che mi sembra interessante nel suo intervento riecheggia una cosa che molti anni fa, prima dell'esistenza del web come lo conosciamo oggi, mi diceva una persona che conoscevo, che era: diffida di un servizio, di un qualsiasi servizio che ha un costo che viene offerto gratuitamente, perché quando ciò accade significa che la merce sei tu. Allora, Michel, tu hai studiato come affrontare i problemi, problemi e possibili alternative al capitalismo attraverso il peer-to-peer. Stai conducendo un esperimento interessante in America Latina. Ce ne vuoi parlare?
Okay. Thank you. I will start with first with the theme of the day. And so my position is, internet technology in general is not good, not bad, but it's also not neutral. And so I think I'm probably more or less on the same line as Evgeny on this, that technology reflects social values. So there's no such thing as one internet. There are many, many different facets to it. And one way I use to explain this is I have a quadrant system where, if you can imagine it in front of your eyes, you have centralized control, distributed control on the vertical axis, and you have for-profit versus for-benefit orientation. So what is a for-profit orientation with a centralized control? This is the Facebook. This is what I call netarchical capitalism. If you look at Facebook, the front end is peer-to-peer. You can do many things as a citizen, not just sharing, you can self-organize. I just want to give a little example from the region where I live, because I live in Thailand. So this is a group of monks that don't like cows to be slaughtered, right? They use Facebook to identify cows that they can save. They can't save all the cows, obviously, so they have to be careful about which ones they choose. Then they do crowdfunding on Facebook. And if you're a Buddhist, if you give to the monks, and they can do something good with it, you obtain merit, right? Which is you have the karma, which is a bad thing, and the merit is the good thing. So the people who do this, who give money to the monks to save the cows, obtain merit, and then the cows are given to poor people. Well, for me, this is a brilliant hack, if to use a technical language. This is a value group that is using Facebook in a very interesting way, and they can do that. So this is the front end, if you like, the peer-to-peer dynamic, which is enabled by the front end. But of course, we know that the back end is completely different. It's centralized, it owns your data, it sells your data, it sells your attention, and it manipulates you. One conversation I had a few years ago was the following. So if you're female and you change your picture, on average, 12 other of your female friends will also change their picture, and 300 more males will look at your picture, on average. Okay, the figures may be wrong, but that's what I remember. Okay, So what do? Right? They send you reminders. Have you changed your picture lately? Right? So yes, you think you're free, but in fact there's all kinds of multiple ways in which, because they control the back end, they can actually drive your behavior in ways that may not be the behaviors that you want. So this is for-profit orientation with a centralized control of the internet. There's a second model, which I call distributed capitalism. And here's where Bitcoin comes in. As you know, Bitcoin is the peer-to-peer, so-called peer-to-peer currency, because any computer can produce the currency and it's used by the hacker class and etc. And it's, it has a certain value. It's working a lot for casinos and all the stuff, but let's say it's working. But when you look at the design of Bitcoin, it's a libertarian anarcho-capitalist design, right? They think that everybody should be free to trade and exchange as an individual capitalist. And so the peer-to-peer element in Bitcoin is the computer. So if you're a hacker and you believed in Bitcoin in the beginning, you have 10,000 computers and a botnet, and we know now that about 12 people own 70% of the Bitcoins, and these were the people who were in early in the game, predicting the value of Bitcoin later on, and they are basically the 1% of the Bitcoin class, right? But if you're an Indian farmer and you don't have any computer, you can't play the game, right? So this is clearly an interpretation of peer-to-peer, which is not an egalitarian peer-to-peer as maybe somebody on the left would understand it. There's a value system in there that determines the technology, how it functions. Now, on the other side of the quadrant, I make a difference between what I call local resilience and global commons. So you have a for-benefit orientation with the aim of protecting your community. And there is a lot going on in the world where, for example, in the last 2 years, the production of urban gardening in the United States, collective urban gardening, has gone up with 48%. There is no doubt that this has to do with internet, with the fact that people now have technology where they can do yard sharing, fruit sharing, all kinds of things that were very hard to do before. So they're using the technology with their value system and embedding that in their platforms, right? Then the last one I call global commons. Think about Wikispeed, the open source car. It's an entirely different vision of production where you have a global open design community that designs sustainable, biodegradable car that's designed to be made in a microfactory. So you don't need billions of dollars to produce a car. You need a few, maybe $10,000 to produce a car. And you could then do that on a local level. But you're organized globally, right? So here again, the value system that's behind it is based on creating global commons of knowledge, of enabling local production, but at the same time, all the people who make the car can organize themselves on a global level in a global co-op and create counterpower to the capitalist multinationals. So, okay, so this is 4 examples where it's not the same technology, actually. We all call it the internet, but it's designed in different ways because the value system of the people using it, and they have power to change the technology, change the protocols that govern their technological infrastructure. And I think that goes a bit in the way that, what Evgeny was trying to say, that you can reuse, you can have a vision of technology where the technology is in function of your values and your social ideals and your material interests. And we live in a society where we have antagonistic social interests, and so the technology that's going to be made by Facebook is not the same technology that can be made by a peer-producing community, right? So for me, in the work that I do with the P2P Foundation, yes, we have capital and labor, the traditional, one of the traditional antagonisms that we have in our society, but increasingly we have another contradiction, and this is the contradiction between peer producers, commoners, creating common pools of value, open knowledge, free software, open hardware, and netarchical capital. And my contention in the P2P work that we're doing is that we are actually building a new mode of production where the value is no longer created in the private sphere, privatized through intellectual property, through buying people's labor and then making money on the market, but is deposited by contributors in a common pool. It's managed by a new type of democratic institutions. I call them for-benefit associations. Nearly every free software community has one. And it creates an entrepreneurial coalition around it. And this is where also politics intervenes. Because right now, I call it a proto-mode of production. Why? Because we are creating commons and it's working. But we can't make a living doing it, right? So and let's look back at Facebook in that case. Facebook is fantastic in a way if you look at use value. Seriously, I love, seriously, I know that's not popular to say, but I love Facebook. It's easy, I have all my friends there. I spend 2 hours a day on Facebook communicating with my community. And in a way, it's a good deal, you could say, right? And most people think that way in practice because they use it and they don't mind that Facebook is a corporate platform. But now if you look at exchange value, here is a system where the users produce 100% of the value. But 0% of the exchange value goes back to the people who create that value. So, seen from the point of view of exchange value, we have to talk of hyper-exploitation. And frankly, this can only be a parasitic system. Imagine capitalism would work like that everywhere. But this is actually a problem we are facing with the effects of internet. So we have created a system which allows people in the world to exponentially increase the use value they are producing by themselves, outside of the control, the direct control of corporations and government. But the monetization of it is only happening on a linear basis. And so the gap between the value creation and the value capture is increasing, and the part that the people get for their use value, for their value creation is diminishing. There is a study by Trevor Scholz, who is an American labor researcher in New York. And he has found out that the average wage in crowdsourcing platforms is $2 an hour. So it's way below the American minimum wage, right? So this, if you place the technology in a social context, you can see that these effects are not neutral and they reflect power relationships. Now, so for me the key is, because peer production is happening, the digital commons of free software and open hardware designs are growing exponentially. So we have on the one hand mutualization of knowledge, open source, and we have mutualization of infrastructures, the sharing economy, the co-working spaces, the hacker spaces are growing exponentially. Just a few examples. 4 years ago I was in Barcelona, there was one co-working space, today there are 50. 3 years ago I was in Vienna, there was one hacker space, today there are 15 just in one city. And there are about like 40 in Thailand, right? Anyway, so it's growing, so these things are happening, but they're still happening under the control of financial capital. And this, I think, is the struggle of today, is to change that. Now I can't go into details, I have my ideas, and I will conclude with what we are trying to do in Ecuador. So Ecuador is still pretty much a neo-colonial economy. They export raw material, oil, coffee, with very little added value, as they say in economics. But they have to buy consumption goods and machinery at very high added value, right? So, and I don't know if you read the recent report that it costs 3 times more to transport goods than to make them, right? This is what we have today in neoliberal globalization. And so these countries have a very bad rap, right? They can't get out of this dependency that they're in to that system. So basically the president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa, has declared, and we take him on his word, that he wants an economy based on open knowledge commons to transform the productive matrix of Ecuador. So imagine farmers who now, well, if they're small farmers, forget about machines because the industry is not making machines for you. It's as simple as that. The only machines they're making is for big industrial agriculture. Imagine you would have an open agricultural machining design community where Ecuador could benefit from the technological innovations of the whole world. And then they would have a set of micro factories in the country creating a domestic industry of agricultural machines without IP, without super profits to Western multinationals. Okay, I can stop here because that's essentially the project. What I'm doing there is the research for it. So we were producing a research and we'll produce policy documents by March next year. And of course, we don't control Ecuadorian politics, but we hope it will actually be the first country in the world where the peer-to-peer economy, which already exists on a grassroots level, can actually scale because it has this kind of national support. So I'll come back in a year and tell you about it.
Thank you, Michel. So we all can agree or disagree with what Michel just said, but I think there's an important point in it, and it's that it's not a matter of technology, but it's a matter of what you make of it and where goes the value created by it. So Michel told us that notwithstanding his critique of the current system, he spends a couple of hours a day on Facebook. Andrew, do you spend any time on Facebook at all?
No, I'm not on it, so I can't spend any time on it.
So do you want to tell us why?
Well, can I respond to a couple of what people said?
Of course.
Because otherwise it's boring. So I'm a little... How many of you have strong feelings about the internet? No? Only one of you? So why are you here? I'm a little troubled by this idea that we're not allowed to have strong feelings anymore, for or against. Because I buy the idea, obviously, that the internet is epiphenomenal in some ways and that it reflects other things. That's obvious. But I think it's... I don't know if I use the word dangerous, but it's, I'm not sure if it's healthy to shift the conversation away from the internet and say, well, we need to talk about politics or economics or sociology, because the internet is those things or are those things too, and technology doesn't exist separately from those things. So, I mean, maybe we can talk about that later, but this idea of dualism is a tricky one, and it's in a way it's obvious, but in a way I think it's useful. And Nathan, you said something about women. What did you say?
Briefly, I said that. The panel represents a specific standpoint. There's not a lot of diversity up here, and having more voices is important to capture more of the realities and critiques and benefits of the internet.
But particularly in terms, what did you say about women?
They're not here. Oh,
they're not here. I see. I see. Well, let me try and be a woman for a while. Anyway, so my book. Digital Vertigo is about women. It's about two kinds of women. I wrote a narrative about the internet. Well, it's not really about the internet, it's about social media, built around Hitchcock's Vertigo. How many of you have seen the film Vertigo? Oh, good. Some of you. It's definitely a good movie. And the title of this panel is what? The black and the white?
The net in black and white.
The net in black and white. So let me offer you a different version of the net. The net in blondes and brunettes. It's because women, I mean, I'm not so much interested in male brunettes or blondes. So in Hitchcock's Vertigo, he offers two kinds of women. It's as with all Hitchcock's movies, it's a very moralistic film. It's a film about, I think he's trying to teach us something. And he offers two kinds of women. Firstly, and they're both acted by Kim Novak. So maybe maybe Hitchcock's also making the argument that dualism doesn't really exist. So the first act of Kim Novak is as a blonde, a very beautiful San Francisco heiress. She's glamorous and glorious and mysterious, very sexy. And the everyman in the movie, Jimmy Stewart, there's only one Jimmy Stewart. The Hitchcock's dualism doesn't extend to the male. But Jimmy Stewart's, the male in the movie, falls in love with this blonde. Who wouldn't fall in love with a woman like that? And Hitchcock's, the whole point of the film, at least the first part of the film is, I guess, dualistic on lots of different levels. The film is sort of very much divided into parts, into two parts, two women, blah, blah, blah. But the guy falls in love with this woman. She's glamorous, beautiful, all the rest of it. And Hitchcock trains his camera on this woman. This is a film about watching and being watched. So it's a film both about voyeurism and surveillance, which is one of the reasons I used the film to talk about social media. And then there's another woman in the film, and this is the real woman. This is the brunette, because the blonde is an invention. The woman is, I mean, obviously the film is an invention too, but in the narrative of the film, the blonde doesn't really exist. She's made up. And the truth behind the blonde is a brunette, a shop girl from Kansas, who turns out to be sort of an accomplice to the murder. Now, the film is about kind of madness. It's how Jimmy Stewart realizes that the blonde is a fraud, and even though he fell in love with the blonde, he tries to dress the brunette back up as the blonde. And the film ultimately ends in the suicide of the brunette, who's also the blonde. It's kind of complicated, but it's not as complicated as I'm making it out to be. So what does this have to do with the internet? As probably some of you are thinking, which sometimes I did also while I was writing this book. But I think it's interesting in the sense that perhaps we need to fetishize the internet, as to take another word from Nathan. We need to fetishize it. We need to have strong feelings about it, for or against. I think that's healthy. And I think Yevgeny, even though he would never publicly acknowledge it, would also has very strong feelings about it. And by shifting the focus doesn't mean you aren't having strong feelings about the internet. And I think what's interesting about the blonde and the brunette is that when Jimmy Stewart falls out of love with the blonde and realizes that she's a fraud, he's not interested in the brunette, which might suggest that perhaps as we begin to understand the internet in its complexity, as it's quote-unquote real, we'll fall out of love with it. But coming back to Facebook and digital vertigo, my book is that digital vertigo is a warning against, and again, I don't think I have anything particularly original to repeat here, it's a warning against being turned into a commodity, which is what Facebook is doing. I think Michelle kind of made that point for me. Facebook is a lie, just as the blonde in the movie was a lie. We're supposed to fall in love with the idea of Facebook, of posting our content, of being the subject of the internet, but actually we're the object. And we are the equivalent of Jimmy Stewart in the movie. We are being taken advantage of because we're being told by networks like Facebook that we're very important, we're very interesting. We're so important and interesting that we're going to give you technology in which you can post yourself, you can network, you can do all sorts of wonderful things, and it's such a wonderful product, we're going to actually give it to you for free. But of course, the reality of that is something very different. As everybody said on the panel, these technologies are seductions. They are the technological equivalent of the blonde Kim Novak. They've been designed, they've been created to trick us into thinking that we are actually mastering them when they're mastering us. And the more stuff we post about ourselves, the more we reveal about ourselves, the more data, the more photographs and videos and posts and tweets and all the rest of it, the richer they become. So we're the ones who are being exploited, which is why I'm not on Facebook, even though I'm on Twitter. So I'm not necessarily against being exploited. I just would rather not be on Facebook because it's so annoying. But overall, I think this issue of dualism is an interesting one in the sense that I'm very ambivalent. I can see both sides of the argument, but I think it would be unwise to allow a discussion about the internet to degenerate into arcane academic discourse, because when that happens, everyone's going to get really bored.
Thank you, Andrew. So what is your solution? Should we just turn our smartphones off, disconnect from socials and so on?
Well, I think the first solution is you have to see Vertigo. I think the solution is and again, I think this is what everyone on the panel is saying, is we have to understand our place in this economic system. As Yevgeny said, it's an economic system. As Michel said the same thing. It's designed around appropriating our data and making a profit out of it. So I think when we begin to understand those things, perhaps we'll behave a little bit more responsibly, or perhaps not, I don't know. I mean, some people, there are a lot of arguments say that people know exactly what's going on and that they're willing to trade their personal data for this great technology. If that's the case, if everyone's cool about having all their stuff out there, as long as they don't have to pay for the service, that's fine. I also think, and in this sense, I think there is a role for government. I think one of the things that is lost, I think Michel brought this up, was that there is a kind of a libertarian philosophy at the very root of the internet. And perhaps because it was built by libertarians. There's a whole literature on this about the counterculture that turned away from politics and instead built the internet. There's a great book called From Counterculture to Cyberspace on this. So I think that we need to understand that the internet itself, I wouldn't say it's an anti-government conspiracy, because I think I don't like any kind of conspiracy. But I do think that it's not coincidental that this general kind of cultural rebellion against authority, the crisis of authority, the challenge to traditional industrial and cultural elites, all these things are going on at the same time as the increasing dominance of the internet and P2P networks and distributed technology. And I think that the solutions are either we get our act together as individuals or the government becomes more involved. And I do think there is a role for government. In America, of course, that's not a popular position. But I think there is a need for government to be much more aggressive in terms of companies like Facebook and Google, in terms of controlling them, in terms of forcing them to forcing them to tell the truth about their products, to have terms of service that you don't have to have a law school degree to understand, and not to be continually playing cat and mouse. There's a couple of other solutions as well. I think there's a market solution. I applaud the development of sort of anti-Facebook, anti-Google companies like DuckDuckGo, privacy-centric companies, companies whose business models are not built on essentially giving data away to advertisers. And I also think, or hope at least, there may be some technological solutions. We do have to figure out a way, and I don't know whether this can be done technologically or in business or cultural terms, we do need to figure out a way to teach the internet how to forget. Because that's the core problem. It hasn't learned how to forget. It, of course, not being a person or a sentient being. I'm not suggesting it is. But we need to figure out ways to integrate forgetting into the network. And there may be a technological solution. I know there are some scientists in Holland working on sort of data degeneration technologies. There may be a role for government here. So I don't think there's a single solution to the Facebook, Google problem. There's not a single solution to the way in which we're being transformed into data and the way we're being exploited. It requires all of us to be more coherent and responsible. It requires these companies to be more accountable. There is a role for government, and I hope that the market and technology can also play a role.
Thank you, Andrew. Maybe everybody should have just talking about teaching internet how to forget. Maybe everybody of us should just have a button saying clear my cache, and that could be.
That button.
You do?
Yeah, in your browser you have that. It doesn't.
Yeah, it doesn't work. That doesn't work. A real one.
But no, you really want that?
Oh, maybe sometimes we should have the possibility to do that. No?
Well, I think that goes to the other extreme. I think that, again, one of the problems is that, users want everything. So when it comes to privacy, user wants everything. So privacy is a complicated issue because it's dominated by two things. Firstly, our modern desire to broadcast everything about ourselves and to think that we're really interesting and important. And on the other hand, our obsession with our own privacy and keeping our data out of the hands of everybody else. I think there has to be an element of accountability. If you post a series of really stupid things on the internet, at some point you have to be accountable. Just as in real life, and again I fall into that trap of dualism, but just as off the internet, if I sat here today and made some outrageous comment that would undermine my professional career, not that I have much of a professional career, I don't have a button, and I shouldn't have a button, because we have to be accountable for our mistakes. The problem is that maybe that button could be developed, and I'm sure it would be popular, and it would be sold and probably designed to exploit the people who were going to press it.
Sure.
Just a few remarks. For me, the solution is data ownership, right? There's absolutely no reason why your data should be the ownership of Facebook or the government. So if we have a system where the data that we generate through our activity are under our control, then that would be really a systemic solution to that problem.
So data is the oil of our age, so data should be owned by us. Nathan, and then Alex.
Be very brief, but I think we are kind of butting up against the limits to the diversity of this panel again. Economic concerns are really, really important. If you ask me what's most important, I would agree it's these economic concerns, but so far, much of this discussion has kind of reduced everything to economics. And I think there's so many more interesting things that we could be talking about, the positives and negatives of the internet. For instance, I absolutely agree with Andrew on the idea of we need more forgetfulness in the internet, more. I've been writing quite a bit right now on ephemeral and forgetful social media. And I think another take on that, in addition to privacy and data ownership concerns, those are in exploitation, really, really important issues. But what if we think about how we experience the world, the fact that we know that, if I can take a picture. There's so many different ways I can document this room right now. I could take a picture, I could tweet, I can check in on Facebook. And all of those things, social media has been made to be very permanent. So I think what that has done, and this is getting away from the economic concerns, but getting into our own experience of the world, what social media has done is given us a very nostalgic view of the present. Because the present, through social media documentation, is always some future past, right? We can document something and it's going to be there. And I think we've have this very nostalgic view of the world. And I think the Instagram filters that look like old photos are such a great example of that. And so I think we don't live in the present as much as we could, and more ephemeral or temporary social media where you share something and it's just about now. It's not going to go into some record, some museum of your own identity that just accumulates and adds up. I think that could be really fun and really interesting and change the way we view the world. And I think this is just one example of how we can talk about privacy and data ownership out of more than just economic terms. I think we have a very econometric bias on this panel right now. I also want to think about phenomenology. Let's think about identity. Let's think about politics. What does that mean for race, class, sexuality, embodiment? And all those things are changing. So I just kind of maybe want to mix this up just a little bit more than just talking about economics.
So it's not just economic, but Alex, tu hai curato un libro che si intitola Society Reloaded, che in qualche modo cerca di affrontare una filosofia diversa ai tempi della rete, non solo dal punto di vista economico, ma anche da altre prospettive. Ce la vuoi raccontare?
Sì, in realtà, Nathan, credo che non sia un caso che poi il panel sfoci, no, in una deriva economicistica, proprio perché in realtà è la società in cui siamo immersi che è intrisa, no, di questa relazione, se vogliamo, forzata, no, con delle dinamiche di mercato. Quindi sostanzialmente, ahimè o per fortuna, ci si ritrova sempre, no, a fare i conti con discorsi, se vogliamo, che vanno anche a ripescare, no, anche nel lessico, se vogliamo, discorsi molto in voga, anzi dal pensiero anche marxista, no, in questo momento, che è molto come dire, recuperato, proprio perché si cerca di capire, no, nel momento in cui siamo di fronte, no, alla crisi del presente, innanzitutto di capire se sono possibili altre strade percorribili, magari anche guardandosi un po' indietro e cercando, secondo me, la cosa più interessante, quella però di andare avanti. Io, Massimo, scusami, devo dirti che non sono poco in imbarazzo in questo panel, perché voglio dire, credo che sia stato detto un po' tutto e tanto, e non mi va adesso di aggiungere nulla di teorico a quanti meglio di me hanno potuto farlo. Vuol dire, ho avuto la fortuna di condividere percorsi di ricerca, momenti sull'etnografia digitale con Nathan. Posso definirmi a pieno titolo un discepolo di Michel Bauwens per tante cose che facciamo insieme e via dicendo. Quindi credo che la cosa interessante è che da cui noi siamo partiti, no, un po' col gruppo di ricerca sul societying, era proprio quello di andare anche praticando, no, quindi giocando, no, con nuove forme di futuro, come tra l'altro anche è chiamato il festival, delle altre vie percorribili. E per rispondere ad alcuni dei tweet che ho visto sul wall, no, qualcuno si lamentava, diceva, purtroppo dice, ogni volta che si parla di internet poi si finisce a parlare di Facebook, e forse non so chi di voi l'ha scritto, che non so se è qui o ci segue da casa, eccolo, e forse ha ragione, effettivamente devo dire che ci troviamo sempre in questa deriva.
È l'esperienza quotidiana della rete per 14 milioni di italiani,
no, per questo,
e siamo il quinto paese,
certo, per
più,
questo motivo,
più popoloso.
No, era proprio per dire, perché
sicuro è una cosa rilevante.
Era rilevante, però appunto ma la cosa interessante qual è? È il fatto che forse finalmente cosa sta succedendo? Succede che l'innovazione fortunatamente sta uscendo fuori da un'elite, sostanzialmente, come dire, dal circolo, no, degli scienziati dell'innovazione, e sta iniziando a permeare, diciamo, un po' la nostra contemporaneità. Questo cosa vuol dire? Vuol dire che, secondo me, benché quelli che sono definiti nuovi media non sono nuovi media, perché di internet ormai è dal 96 che è un fenomeno sempre più di massa. Quello che sta succedendo è che però gli effetti, secondo me, di certe pratiche sono ancora tardi a venire. Quindi io credo che il nodo della questione sia sul fatto che noi utilizziamo oggi delle piattaforme con una forma mentis vecchia, e quindi il fatto che la maggior parte di noi continua a immaginarsi, quindi perciò un discorso è molto sull'immaginazione. Se io continuo a immaginarmi un cittadino consumatore, non potrò far altro che fruire da consumatore in quell'ecosistema che invece mi richiede di essere un pubblico produttivo. Cioè il problema è che la maggior parte di noi entra anche su Facebook, che facciamo? Andiamo là e accendo, e quindi io da consumatore entro, mi vado a vedere le foto, cioè cerco le cose di cui posso fruire, no? Che posso consumare. In realtà l'architettura proprio, no, della rete, per come è fatta, ci richiederebbe un senso di responsabilità diverso. Cioè la prima cosa che noi dovremmo fare entrando nella rete è chiedersi: ok, io cosa faccio per meritarmi di essere qui? Connesso con tutto il resto, consapevole che ogni mia azione determina dei cambiamenti, delle interazioni. E quindi per questo ci siamo divertiti a andare oltre Facebook, oltre, diciamo, il discorso, cioè il chiedersi se le tecnologie sono delle seduzioni, come si è detto da Kin e come qualcuno di voi ha ribadito su Twitter. Sono sicuramente delle seduzioni, come tutti i prodotti del mercato, perché il mercato oggi, come lo conosciamo, si basa su delle seduzioni e quindi su dei desideri e quindi su delle immaginazioni. E quindi vi ripeto, oltre ogni dato appunto teorico che non mi va di fare, ma anche di ragionamento credo sterile su se la rete sia buona o cattiva, come tutte le cose della società è buona e cattiva, quindi voglio dire, dipende da come vedo le cose. Posso fare il discorso sulle multinazionali, Google, Facebook, che comunque siamo schiavi delle nuove multinazionali della rete, da un lato, però è anche vero che senza internet migliaia di start-up, di nuove imprese, di neoartigiani non avrebbero un senso oggi, e quindi anche in questa rivoluzione, se vogliamo, digitale. Potrei dire che c'è tanta sorveglianza sui dati, il fatto che tutto quello che diciamo nella rete serve a essere monitorato e a creare consapevolezza dei mercati, bla bla bla. Le diciamo queste cose perché sono vere, però è anche vero che su Facebook critical mass si aggrega, quindi ci sono piattaforme che servono anche, pur non determinandole, anche delle rivoluzioni dal basso. Potrei dire che siamo insieme ma soli, per celebrare un titolo famoso in voga ultimamente, cioè il fatto che della solitudine creata dai social media. Un po' non è vero, perché poi credo che sia un problema più generale, ma è anche vero che tramite Facebook, per esempio, e le piattaforme di socializzazione più commerciali, oggi migliaia di festival, di rave, di aggregazioni proprio di persone che si incontrano nella realtà hanno luogo. Invece mi andava, e mi dispiace per chi di voi ci ha seguito negli altri appuntamenti, perché dirò sempre le stesse cose, perché il tema che noi stiamo affrontando col gruppo di Society in questi giorni è questo. Mi faceva piacere di parlarvi di un'esperienza che abbiamo condotto, quella a cui faceva riferimento Massimo in apertura, che adesso appunto ha avuto accesso anche a un programma di finanziamento del MIUR sul Social Innovation Cluster. Era quello di andare a mappare proprio in maniera, il tutto nasce in maniera anche provocatoria, no? Quando si parlava sempre di questa rete, l'immateriale, Facebook, eccetera, capire invece cosa concretamente in alcune aree, e il mio accento tradisce una provenienza biellese, quindi vi parlo, diciamo, vi parlo della Campania, quindi vi parlo di un'esperienza dove a un certo punto abbiamo iniziato a notare per caso, no, qualche anno fa, che tantissimi giovani straschillati, che ha studiato all'estero, presenti sui nuovi media, magari che occupati anche in professioni contemporanee, aveva fatto una scelta, cioè quella di ritornare ad occuparsi della terra, delle campagne, cioè a fare i contadini. Inutile dirlo che non lo potevano fare e non lo vogliono fare come era una volta, soltanto con la zappa. E quindi tutto questo movimento, diciamo, di downshifting che vedeva questi ragazzi, vedeva utilizzare quindi anche la rete per in qualche modo fare la vita che gli piaceva, cioè sostanzialmente per affrancarsi, se vogliamo, anche da quella dimensione del mercato, quella dimensione di cui abbiamo parlato, quella dimensione biocapitalistica, se vogliamo, e poi sarebbe interessante aprire una tematica anche su questo filone. E quindi abbiamo fatto, se mi passi un attimo il telecomandino, no, vi faccio vedere solo delle immagini a volo così. Questo le summer school che abbiamo fatto col gruppo di Society, con tutti i nostri amici, quindi con l'aiuto anche di Michel, di Jaromil, di John Grant, Bill Emmott, Arduino, abbiamo iniziato a vedere, no, questo fenomeno che vi dicevo, tanto da iniziare a organizzare dei percorsi, quindi delle summer school, dei momenti informali di incontro dove con questi ragazzi abbiamo cercato di capire come internet, l'utilizzo dei nuovi media, delle nuove tecnologie potesse sostenere uno stile di vita diverso, ovvero una nuova immaginazione. E quindi abbiamo costruito le nostre aule magne, le abbiamo riempite di persone interessanti con tablet e connessioni, abbiamo unito vecchi e nuovi saperi, no? Dice sempre il nostro amico Michele, l'homo saper e l'homo faber insieme. Abbiamo indagato possibilità interessanti col progetto di Open Source Ecology, dove addirittura quindi attraverso la rete facilmente abbiamo potuto trovare progetti open per realizzare attrezzature costosissime in modalità low cost e magari, perché no, disponibili a una comunità, quindi uscendo fuori anche da un concetto di proprietà, entrando in uno di fruizione condivisa. Sì, queste poi sono prove di monete alternative. E quindi questa è la dimensione forse che mi sta mancando un po' in questi giorni, ma mi manca un po' in un certo modo forse di approcciare le tematiche massimo dell'innovazione, che è la dinamica anche del gioco. Cioè, scusatemi, non voglio banalizzare, ma secondo me anche facendo, se è vero che abbiamo bisogno di nuove categorie mentali, è soltanto giocando, praticandole, che possiamo in qualche modo capire se alcuni altri immaginari hanno un senso. Quindi forse sarebbe stato oggi bellissimo stare insieme e magari iniziare a provare altri modi di stare insieme e da lì tirare fuori una metafora per capire magari che significa la rete. È quello che abbiamo cercato di fare con Simone Cicero, dove cercammo di capire dei modelli economici, però l'abbiamo fatto fare ai ragazzi, cioè uscendo fuori dalla dimensione anche della somministrazione, diciamo, del sapere. E quindi alla fine si è creato questo spazio fisico e virtuale, che è un Rural Hub, che è un primo spazio di coworking che ha una prima sede fisica, ne avrà tante altre adesso in giro per l'Italia, e tutta una rete di saperi, diciamo, che nella rete metteremo in condivisione con chi vuole fare questa scelta. E quindi voglio dire, come vedete, quello che è venuto fuori dal discorso di oggi, vi ripeto, volevo dire tante cose, ma vado avanti, mi fa più piacere discutere, e alla fine è un atto politico, cioè è una scelta. Abbiamo degli strumenti e dobbiamo noi decidere che deriva darli, come utilizzarli, come riuscire anche, come dire, a lavorare appunto a immaginazioni diverse. La cosa interessante, devo dire che, e sottolineo quanto ha affermato Nathan, capire come le pratiche, tuttavia, della rete ci aiutino, al di là dell'economia, a un pensiero diverso. Cioè, pensate già il concetto di tempo, no? Come cambia. Io parlo sempre di questa cosa. Cioè, noi siamo abituati, ormai diamo per scontato che il tempo sia soltanto il cronos, no? La dimensione cronologica del tempo come divenire, che, se ricordate, era il tempo del broadcast della televisione, cioè il palinsesto che va avanti. È la mia vita che gli corre dietro, no? Addirittura si andava a letto dopo Carosello, bene o male il pranzo a casa mia era quando c'era il telegiornale. Oggi invece si ritorna alla dimensione anche del kairos, no? Del tempo come scelta. Cioè, pensate a YouTube, io posso vedermi Happy Days o l'ultimo video degli Arcade Fire, ho questa possibilità di scegliere anche il tempo, e quindi è interessante pensare anche a uno sviluppo che non prevede una modernità come l'abbiamo conosciuta, ma giovani che scelgono elementi del futuro ma anche da quelli del passato, che non significa diciamo, folclorico amarcord, ma la possibilità di costruirsi giorno per giorno il proprio presente. E quindi ancora una volta, appunto, come vi dico, diventa un'azione politica, una scelta. Quindi è un po' questo, cioè, secondo me è importante lavorare su categorie nuove, proprio perché è importante lavorare, secondo me, su una nuova immaginazione. Io vi dico una cosa, da meridionale terrone mediterraneo, ogni tanto è buono pure starsi zitti, quindi per me io ho finito qua, non vorrei dire, se no, veramente, non c'è niente da aggiungere alle cose che hanno detto, sono qua a disposizione, magari mi farebbe piacere avere un feedback su questo percorso, su questo numero rilevante di ragazzi, perché in realtà abbiamo mappato almeno ad oggi 500-600 ragazzi che hanno aperto delle start-up in campagna, e quindi occupandosi sostanzialmente di ruralità attraverso poi l'utilizzo dei nuovi media. E allora mi immagino che così come c'è per la campagna, la cosa interessante è che si stanno praticando nuove forme di futuro, spero nella sanità, nella pubblica amministrazione. Io credo che il momento oggi è di giocare, di praticare e di fare degli errori, perché solo cadendo puoi imparare a rialzarti. Questo è il mio piccolo contributo.
E forse dovremmo celebrare di più i fallimenti, imparare a cadere più spesso e rialzarci anche più in fretta. Ringrazio Alex. Prima di passare alle domande del pubblico, sempre che poi gli altri interlocutori non vogliono commentare le cose che sono emerse, c'era una questione che non ha affrontato Evgeny nel suo ragionamento iniziale, che invece mi piacerebbe chiedergli, non ci siamo passati prima, ed è una questione geopolitica. Per l'esperienza che ho avuto della rete, anche della rete, perché abbiamo parlato in qualche modo dell'attitudine dei macro processi economici, abbiamo parlato della necessità del cambiamento di attitudine. Alex ci ha raccontato come è necessario in qualche modo sperimentare e provare a misurarsi con queste nuove dimensioni. Non abbiamo parlato per nulla dell'aspetto, diciamo, geopolitico, nel senso che per come ho imparato a conoscere io la rete fin dall'inizio, la rete è sempre stata un allentamento dei macro processi di controllo sociale tradizionale. Cioè, se ci pensate, uno dei buoni indicatori ancora oggi per vedere se un paese è democratico o meno è vedere che rapporto ha o che tipo di libertà lascia ai propri cittadini sul digitale. Ecco, volevo chiedere a Evgeny una cosa che ha scritto di recente a questo riguardo mi ha un po' stupito, nel senso che argomentando sulla necessità in qualche modo, sulla non ineluttabilità che le cose andassero in questo modo, cioè che si creasse quel meccanismo di cui ha parlato prima, di grandi aziende che poi proliferano sulla compravendita dei nostri dati. Ecco, diceva, avrebbe potuto esserci comunque una via nazionale a internet, e ad esempio fa racconti di paesi che non hanno ceduto la propria sovranità, diciamo in questo senso, agli Stati Uniti, ma che hanno costruito dei propri sistemi, cioè ad esempio la Cina, che credo sia l'unico al mondo di una intranet totalmente compiuta, ma anche l'Iran, che non ha usato Gmail ma ha sviluppato un proprio sistema di posta, e la stessa Russia. Ecco, ci racconti un po' questo aspetto, ci spieghi, perché poi, come dire, stupisce un po' il fatto che questi sono paesi che comunque, se ciò hanno fatto, l'hanno fatto principalmente per avere uno strumento di controllo sui propri cittadini.
Sure. So I'll answer that question, and if I have some time, I'd like to make two comments that are not related to the question. So with regard to the question, I think once you let go of the very idea of the internet, as I've done some time ago, there is no contradiction whatsoever in some of the moves that you are seeing now by foreign governments, actually all governments, to try to secure their own communication, but also their ability to monitor what the citizens are up to, and to make sure that other countries and other governments are not monitoring what their leaders and politicians are up to. I don't think it has anything to do with the internet. It has everything to do with common sense. If you have any national secrets, so if your national businesses in Italy or in Germany or in Russia or in China have any business secrets, you would want to have secure networks in place that will make sure that those secrets are not abused by governments or companies in other countries. And it's the same when you think about political secrets. So what is happening right now, I think, is that a lot of people in the wake of the NSA scandal have realized that their reliance on American infrastructure has probably been too great and too naive and too excessive, and they're trying to lessen it. And they're trying to lessen it for business, economic, national security reasons. Many of those governments are trying to do it for reasons that have to do with suppressing or preventing any potential anti-government, pro-democratic turmoil. So the Russians and the Iranians and the Chinese have learned their lessons from the power of digital networks and communication networks to bring people together in far less time than other networks, and they are trying to make sure that their citizens communicate on networks that are under government control. So they're either trying to develop or strengthen domestic alternatives to Facebook and Twitter and Google, while blocking access to the actual foreign sites, or they're engaging in all sorts of legalistic and business tricks that make it harder for foreign investors, for example, to come and buy a stake in a Russian social network. So the Russian leaders are debating a set of laws about declaring social networks and search engines as a strategic industry, so that whoever from America or elsewhere comes and wants to buy a share wouldn't be able to do that. Again, I think this is common sense. It has nothing to do with certain assumptions about the internet. They're just making sure that they can actually control, monitor, and see what's happening and prevent others from accessing the data. Can I still make 2 comments?
Sure.
So I just want to respond to Nathan and to Michael. And to Nathan, to you, there are certain things I love about the idea of digital dualism, but I think there is a certain risk that this framework carries. And I think the risk is that whenever you start seeing people who basically say that Facebook or Twitter are inferior to the offline version X or to offline product Y, right? You tend to think that, well, it's because these people are digital dualists. It's because they have certain assumptions about the authenticity or inauthenticity of the digital space versus the real space. But those are not the only reasons why the offline particular product might be preferable to the digital one. I can easily think of so some of the people you engage with, for example, someone like Cheryl Turkle, before she started writing about social media, she's been writing for decades about psychoanalysis. She wrote her first book. Before that, she wrote a book about Lacan. She critiques the evolution of communication modes from a very particular stance in psychology, cognitive psychology, and psychoanalysis. And I think you shouldn't just abandon that mode because the conclusion she reaches happens to oppose Facebook or Twitter, and those are digital platforms as opposed to real-world interaction. Or I can think about, for example, if you start with someone like Habermas, and you take 3 media, you take the coffee house of the 16th to 17th century, you take a newspaper of the mid-20th century, and you take Twitter. And if you start from Habermas's idea of communicative rationality and the ability to let people communicate freely and complexly and to express ideas without being disturbed by economic, political, and other barriers, you might actually end up saying that the coffee house was much better than Twitter. And I'm fine saying that, yes, coffee house may have been superior to Twitter within the framework that Habermas has set up to compare different instances to each other, right? It doesn't mean that he's a digital dualist, right?
Right. I'm not saying that all critiques of the web are dualist. I'm saying that dualist critiques of the web are dualist.
Yeah, so but you're the one who defines them as dualists. You see, this is the problem.
I'm identifying dualism when I see it. So I think that Sherry Turkle's notion of the second self is inherently dualist, the second self. It couldn't be more paradigmatic than that. Not all of Turkle's work is dualist. And actually, I think, and you got me one time, I sort of threw your book, The Net Delusion, into the digital dualist camp. And we end up, and I did do that somewhat flippantly, and I think you called me out on that, and admitted to some amount of dualism at the same time. So I absolutely agree. It's not so in that situation of the coffee house, the newspaper, and Twitter. Those are 3 different technologically mediated environments, and they're all very different, and they're good at some things and bad at other things.
Sure.
That's not necessarily a dualist argument. If you say that the Twitter is in a different world than the coffee shop and the newspaper, and it's virtual and less real, then that's when it becomes dualist. Critique Twitter, just don't do it in a dualist way, is all I'm asking.
Sure, and that I think is fine. I just think that even to someone like Turkle, there is much more complexity than just the ontological assumption that there is a separate reality out there. I just want to make a very quick comment about what Michael said about the solution to the problem of Facebook and Google is to let people take ownership of their data, right? And I think in the abstract, that sounds great. Again, if you start from the existing historical economic conditions, you realize that that's not enough. And that's not enough in part because markets have a way to get around that solution. And the way they get around those solutions is, of course, create more markets where citizens are encouraged to start trading their data. So if you think that your right to privacy is there only to give you the ability to control your own information, and then you completely don't say what you need that right for, what ends up happening is that people start, again, driven and pushed by consumerist logics and by logics that have to do with self-interest and economic rationality, they encourage to start monitoring everything that they can about themselves and put it on the market.
You mean with the Internet of Things?
I mean with self-tracking devices, I mean with apps on your smartphone, I mean with Google Glass, I mean with all, sensors you install in your car to prove to your insurance company that you're a safer driver than they think you are so that you can pay less on insurance. Those are all things that are driven by economic rationale. And if our solution is to simply say, well, let's just give people the ability to control their own data, I mean, this is clearly a necessary step, but it's not a sufficient step in that the current economic system has a way to get to them and get that data from us commercially, right? And then the question is, will state institutions still be able to access that data on the commercial market, right? And it might be that we might tie the hands of NSA, but if NSA or any other intelligence agency can go to an insurance company that controls the sensor in your car, if they can go to your dentist who controls the smart toothbrush in your bathroom, they will get all the data regardless of whether they are tracking you or not, right? The fact that there are commercial intermediaries to whom you, in full control, are giving this data for economic benefit would still result in state institutions getting to that data, right? And here I think we have to understand that it's not just a matter of giving people rights, right? It's also a matter of giving people responsibilities, and some of those responsibilities might be to think harder and to think twice what might happen to that data once they start treating it in a purely abstract, consumerist, economic-driven mode. And it might be that what we need is some kind of information ethics where you would actually be adding political, moral, and ethical concerns to every decision that you take to monitor yourself or to start trading in your own data. It's a very different, what we need basically is some kind of a fair trade system, but not for coffee, but for data, right? Where there are other considerations that are not just about economics, right? That are about politics, that are about justice, that are about fairness, that introduce other dimensions to your decision to self-track, monitor, and engage in economic marketplace that are not reducible to economics. That's just my...
Un sistema equo e solidale per lo scambio dei dati, interessante. Abbiamo ancora una decina di minuti per qualche domanda, se c'era un commento.
A Morozov, rispetto a quello che dice, che il problema però è sempre, si può spostare sempre più a monte, perché diciamo in una società sempre più fluida e a rete, no? Dove i cittadini in qualche modo si stanno riappropriando o hanno l'impressione di riappropriarsi anche della funzione di costruttori dell'immaginario dal basso. Il problema è dove e chi. Quando tu mi dici bisogna rivedere, ripensare, bla bla bla, il problema è dove sono questi centri di decisione, cioè chi è affidato poi questo compito e come far dialogare la necessità, diciamo, tra virgolette istituzionale, quindi dovremmo poi capire che significa anche istituzionale, con invece un'emergenza dal basso.
Well, I mean, so far, it's actually us citizens who are responsible for many of those decisions. You know, if I decide to start monitoring my car to prove that I'm a safer driver, if I start monitoring my health or my eating or my exercise to show that I am much healthier than the insurance company thinks is the case, then I clearly stand to benefit, right? So I will pay less in insurance premium, right? So for me, it's clearly an economic win-win. But it might be that the economic victory for me will, in relative terms, be smaller than the loss to the person who will have to pay more because they would not want to monitor themselves, or they would be forced to monitor themselves and discover they are less healthy than me, and they're less healthy than the average person in the spreadsheet, so they will actually end up paying more, right? And this is where you get into very interesting questions about justice, where my gain is less than somebody's loss. And if you can articulate these problems in that way, it might be that I would actually say my gain is not worth it, because as a moral human being who is concerned about the well-being of other human beings, I actually don't want to have that gain, right? So suddenly you start transforming decisions that previously were just about saving money. They were just about making sure you pay less for insurance, or you pay less for driving your own car. You realize that those are actually decisions that affect society, that affect other people, that affect people who will not be able to profit from this system the way you can. I mean, think about how many of these devices are marketed to us. We're being told that we have a choice. You can either choose to self-track through an app on your smartphone, right, or through a monitor that you attach to your head when you go to bed. Those are also popular now. You can monitor yourself in your sleep. There are all sorts of devices now, right? And we're being told that it's all your own decision. It's all your own choice. But clearly, once social institutions start treating people who track differently by offering them discounts, we soon reach a saturation point, right, where people who refuse to self-track are being treated with suspicion. They're being treated as deviants because the assumption is that they have something to hide. I mean, we were told the same thing about Facebook and the same thing about smartphones 5 years ago. It's all our own choice. No one is forcing us to do that. I mean, right now, if you're not on Facebook and if you don't have a cell phone and you happen to live in the United States, the assumption that NSA makes is that you're hiding Osama bin Laden in your basement. I mean, that's the assumption that is made, right? And you have no choice. If you want to seem normal, if you want to go and rent an apartment, you'd better have a Facebook account so that your landlord can actually check who you are, right? And social logics of how institutions work evolve, and they evolve with these technological infrastructures. So it has to be the case that our decisions about our own self-optimization be actually considered in a much wider social context. And I think so ideally what would happen is that just like now we relate to environment very differently, we relate to our consumption decisions about energy in a very different manner. We can all afford to live electricity in our houses all day long, money-wise, but we don't do that, not just because we want to save money, but because we care about ecology, right? That wasn't the case in the 50s, but it was the case in the 60s and the 70s. Why? Because the Green Movement articulated an entirely new dimension to how we think about consumption. And I think that what we need to have is a similar dimension articulated when it comes to information use and information exchange. And unless we do that, we will end up with NSA getting more and more data and the technocrats engaging in more and more acts of preemption.
I think there's also the politics of this is interesting because what Yevgeny is describing, which I think is real, is the datification of everything and the way in which our relationship with, I'm not sure if it's the state as opposed to insurance companies or perhaps the police, will change. But in a way it is the ideal, it's the libertarian dream of having a viable system without the state. And I think it's not coincidental that as there's this endless crisis of the state and of state services, of medical services, tax rebellions, and all the rest of it, especially in Western democracies, you've got this alternative, what you might think of as a data nudge system emerging, in which will be much more accountable and responsible. But I think Yevgeny is absolutely right to make the point that Whereas the libertarians would say this is a fair system because everyone has the same option to the same tools and all the rest of it. There's actually a massive bias towards the data literate. And what it actually is and will do is formalize a new kind of data aristocracy. And I think we will, as we slip and slide into this world that's being built for us, we will increasingly be nostalgic for the mass industrial 20th century age, which was actually much fairer, much more egalitarian, and offered everyone a much better deal.
Si vedrà se veramente avremo nostalgia del XX secolo, come diceva ora Andrew Keane, oppure no. Certo la cosa interessante è che la prossima volta che la nostra società di assicurazioni ci propone di mettere un sistema di tracking della nostra automobile a bordo per risparmiare, pensiamo che magari questo potrebbe penalizzare quanti questo sistema, per loro ragioni di libertà personale, non lo vogliono fare, che si vedranno alzare il costo dell'assicurazione nella presunzione che abbiano qualcosa da nascondere. Abbiamo ancora qualche minuto, se c'è qualche domanda da parte del pubblico. Domande? Vi abbiamo tramortito. Lì c'è una domanda. C'è un microfono?
So do you prefer the question in English or Italian? English, yeah. Okay. So basically, I find some way absurd this critique to the capitalistic nature of the internet, because it's, I don't know if Nathan probably told this at the very start, it's in the nature of its creation, actually, because it was created as a capitalistic tool. So my question is, in a way, when we criticize the capitalistic nature of this, and on the other hand we praise startups and things like that actually are essentially capitalistic efforts. So my question is, how should we await this transformation in capital? It is something that maybe Michel can answer to this question. Can we expect like a transformation towards a more cooperative capitalism instead of a real diverse, I don't know, kind of strategy? I don't know if the question is clear.
Sì. One other question, un'altra domanda se c'è, e poi rispondiamo a entrambe.
Hi. I'd like to shift again on a more feeling side and not an economic one. And there are a lot of things that I would like to ask, because this is a theme that really interests me. And I work like an experienced designer, but I'm not fond of the internet. So I came here because I thought I'm of the black side. But surprisingly now I realized I agree with Andrew, Morozov, and Nathan at the same time. So one thing that I would like to... Sorry?
So you are grey.
Yeah, I'm grey.
Aren't we black? I mean, no. No. Aren't we black? Is there anyone white on this panel?
So it's a question about emotional thing. I can say that many things on the internet lie because of, for example, I have Facebook and I look at it sometime, and once in a while I saw one of my friends put in a lot of posts about very great events and a lot of meetings, friends, and concerts, and I thought, maybe she left his boyfriend. And that because as soon as she didn't have this, let's say, pardon me, real life thing of her boyfriend, she started being very often on Facebook and posting a lot of contents like my life is wonderful. So many contents on the web, lie. And I want to ask, don't you think that this thing make us more weak? In the sense we see a lot of cool stuff there, but our life isn't actually like that. Because we have to work, to earn money, and spend them to eat, and so on. So it sounds like in the 8th century here, when Italy became Italy, every cultural people was saying Italian people are great, families are great, man goes to work and the family is good and blah, blah, but it was not like that. So after a while, people became sad because they were not like that. So what do you think?
Yes, I will focus on the question by Simone. So this is the way I answered that question. About kind of the post-capitalist potential that we may see in using certain aspects of the internet. And so I focus on the notion of peer production. So the fact that today, and that is related to the emergence of the technology, that there is a possibility for wide-scale self-aggregation of human effort. And so more and more people are contributing to create value together, forming common pools of knowledge, software, and design. But the way it works today is that you have an accumulation of the common, but there's no social self-production within that accumulation. So I'm explaining myself, yes, you can contribute, but if you're going to make a living, you still need to sell your labor to a capitalist enterprise. So if you are a free software developer, you're creating a Linux Commons, but you still have to find a job with IBM if you want to make a living from it. And so that's the key issue. And the way I solve this, or I want to solve this, is by creating an intermediary between the accumulation of the commons and the accumulation of capital, which is what I call cooperative accumulation. So the idea here, and that's my proposal in these communities, is to use a new type of license, which I call the peer production license, which basically makes a difference between a classic free software. There is a real paradox in the licensing, which is, I'll formulate it that way, the more communistic the license, the more capitalistic the practice. So precisely because you have a communistic license, the GPL, it allows IBM to work with it and to exploit it, right? So if you change this by saying only those entities which contribute to our commons can use that commons. Otherwise, you pay a license fee. And so in other words, you force capital to actually pay for the commons that they use. And then as a commoner, as a peer producer, as a free software developer, as an open Arduino designer, you create your own cooperative entities so that the same people who create the value in the commons also create and capture the value. Now this will not change the whole system in, like this, but it will create a sphere within the capitalist system that already starts working on the basis of a different form of value accumulation, and it's kind of like a prefigurative strategy. It doesn't solve the issue of actually fighting the system, changing the system, but it creates kind of an alternative within the system. And if you think about the 19th century and the great welfare state that we had, it's because the workers had created this. They had created unions, mutualities, and the welfare state took it over, but they didn't invent it. And we're losing this because the industrial working class is disappearing, and we are deproletarizing Western economies. And now we have a new crafts class. Free software developers, they're craftspeople controlling largely their own means of production, but they don't control the means of monetizing their work. So this is the key issue today, but I think it's solvable through this strategy and to recreate a new social movement, new social hegemony around the notion of the commons. So I propose something like the Alliance of the Commons, where you have the pirate parties, which represent the digital generations. You have the Greens that represent the natural commons. You have a whole re-emergence of transformative left parties in many countries. So I think there is actually a possibility for a political and sociological majority around the notion of the commons. So it's not state versus market, It's something new that focuses around enabling and empowering the common creation of value.
And I would add to that, I mean, I think this is a really interesting subject. You should look at this. A friend of mine runs a movement called the Maker Movement. He's my neighbor in California, Dale Doherty. And I think what the internet is doing is changing the nature, the notion of making. And I think you're absolutely right that the old welfare state came out of the industrial working class and the nature of capitalism, industrial capitalism and all the rest of it. This new digital economic world is redefining what it means to make stuff. It's redefining the idea of the professional and the amateur. And if there are positives to come out of it, I'm less confident than you that fall back on the old left, the Greens and the Pirates, I think are a bit dodgy. But certainly what we need to see is a new definition of labor, and that needs to come from, say, movements like the Maker Movement, which are rethinking what it means to make things and have value in this digital age.
Quindi i maker non solo dovranno fare la terza rivoluzione industriale, ma anche ridefinire il labor. Interessante. Nathan, la domanda is Facebook brighter than our current life?
I think that's a really great question, and just for a moment to get away from the economics, is talking about the sort of performance on Facebook. Of course, it's not we don't always accurately represent every part of our lives on Facebook or other social media. I definitely agree with Alex that we kind of need to get a little bit post-Facebook on talking about social media. And I think this gets to some of the language on this panel that I don't think is wrong, but we should add something to this idea of databases. Everything is data now, dataization of everything. We hear this all the time, the death of privacy. Everything is on the internet. That's a little bit hyperbole, okay? We don't post everything on Facebook. We don't post everything on the internet. Quite a bit of what we do doesn't go on the internet. We delete a lot that's on the internet. And a lot of the stuff that we put online isn't entirely accurate. It's a performance. And I think there's a little bit of internet centrism going on here, to borrow Evgeny's term. We're kind of blinded by the novelty of the data, and we kind of speak in these hyperbolic terms because there is so much more data, right? We are so much more public that we jump right into this hyperbolic language of, well, now everything is public and everything is turned into data. And I think if we can talk about how we present ourselves on Facebook as a performance, like we've talked about identity for the whole history of social theory. Think about Irving Goffman's work on the presentation of the self. He talks about the self as being sort of like a fan dance, that you reveal some and you conceal some, rather than as the dataization of everything be more like pornography, where everything is exposed. But instead, we're always it's always kind of a performance, and we've been doing that since long before Facebook. I'm putting on a performance right now. I wore a good shirt and I'm posed in certain ways. We're all performing right now. And that sort of performance wasn't invented with Facebook. And how it's changed with the digital, I think, is a really interesting question. But I like how that topic speaks to, I think, the fallacy that privacy is dead and everything has gone into databases.
Grazie Nathan. Credo che siano venute fuori molte cose da questo dibattito. Io ringrazio voi, ringrazio questa splendida sede e tutta la sua storia che incombe un po' su di noi, che ci ha ospitato. E vi ringrazio l'Internet Festival di Pisa e buona prosecuzione.